I'm Evelyn Carter, 38 years old, colonel in uniform, but tonight just a daughter stepping back into the house that no longer feels like home. In this family, love has always been measured in numbers, not sacrifice. My father beams at my brother-in-law's business deals. My mother clings to silence for peace, and my sister hides behind the comfort Richard provides. And me? I'm the reminder of everything they'd rather not see. The breaking point came when Richard raised his glass and laughed. A colonel on paper, but broke in real life. That was the moment I realized I wasn't walking into dinner. I was walking into war. Ever been mocked in your own home? Hit like if you've ever been dismissed for the very thing you sacrificed everything for. Comment if you've been the invisible one at your own table. It started the night I came back from deployment, stepping through the front door into the smell of roasted turkey and apple pie. The words lingered in my chest as I stepped through the front door of the house I grew up in, the smell of roasted turkey and apple pie rushing over me like a ghost from a different lifetime. My boots tapped against the polished wood, each step a reminder of where I had been and where I was now. Michael's text from that morning echoed faintly in my head. Stay calm. Truth has its own timing. I clung to it like a mantra, unsure of how long I'd need to repeat it before the night was over. Margaret, my mother, appeared first. She folded me into a brief hug, warm enough to pass for affection, but with a stiffness that told me she wanted peace more than closeness. George, my father, followed, patting my shoulder twice as though I were a colleague returning from a short trip, not a daughter who had spent 4 years on deployment. My sister Lucy smiled too brightly, her eyes darting toward the dining room as if she had something more important to guard than to welcome me. And then there was Richard, her husband, lounging at the far end of the table, a glass of wine already in hand. He smirked as if my arrival had been staged purely for his amusement. The dining room glowed in late autumn warmth. The overhead chandelier spread a honey-colored light over the table set with turkey, mashed potatoes, bowls of corn, and the inevitable apple pie waiting on the sideboard. It should have felt like homecoming. Instead, the glow only emphasized how alien I was in my own family's orbit. I slid into my seat, the scrape of the chair legs sounding louder than it should have. My nephew David sat across from me, his teenage face open but quiet, his eyes flicking toward me with curiosity that nobody else shared. He didn't smile or laugh, he simply watched. It struck me like a small, fragile promise that maybe not everyone at this table had already judged me. Richard was the first to break the silence. "So, Colonel," he drawled, putting deliberate weight on the title, "back in the land of the free government paycheck?" His smirk widened as the others shifted uncomfortably. My father cleared his throat. Lucy forced a giggle. My mother busied herself adjusting the silverware. I wanted to remind him that ranks weren't just names on paper, that they were scars, lives, nights without sleep, and promises kept in sand and blood. Instead, I stared at my plate. Silence was safer. It allowed me to watch. It allowed me to see who would laugh, who would flinch, who would stay quiet. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine. "Must be strange," he continued, "coming back to all this comfort after scraping by on government pennies." The words dripped with contempt. This time, George coughed out a half-laugh, almost as if agreeing, before he caught himself. Margaret shushed him softly, but the damage was already done. The laughter spread thin and awkward like oil on water. Forks hesitated mid-air, clinking against plates as the sound died. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my hands still. Inside, my chest tightened, the pulse in my throat hammering. Each mocking word struck deeper than he could have known. He had no idea how many nights I'd wished for this kind of dinner, how many times sand-filled rations and canned beans had been my only meal while my family gathered here without me. Richard tipped his glass toward me, his eyes glinting like he had caught a fish and was about to reel it in. "I mean, look at me," he said loudly, turning slightly to catch Lucy's eye. Tesla in the driveway, contract signed before lunch, money rolling in while I sleep. He paused, his smirk growing sharper. Meanwhile, our dear Colonel counts pennies from Uncle Sam. I saw Lucy's smile falter, just for a second, before she ducked her head. David lowered his eyes to his plate. My father shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak up. My mother's hands fluttered at the tablecloth. The weight of their silence told me everything they wouldn't protect me. Not tonight. The food on my plate blurred. My fork lay untouched, gleaming in the light. I reminded myself of Michael's words again. Stay calm. Truth has its own timing. Maybe the truth would come later, but right now, Richard owned the room. He raised his glass higher, smirk aimed directly at me. A colonel on paper, but broke in real life. My Tesla's worth more than your yearly salary. I felt every eye at the table turn toward me, waiting to see if I would break, if I would lash out, or try to defend myself. My hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the fork lying beside my plate. I wrapped my fingers around it and tightened my grip until the cold metal bit into my palm. Evelyn grips her fork tightly, her silence sharper than any reply. At the dinner table, words cut deeper than knives. The candlelight flickered against the chandelier as dusk pressed its shadows through the windows, stretching long lines across the walls. The turkey was carved, the mashed potatoes passed around, and yet the warmth of the food did nothing to soften the sting of the air between us. I heard Maria Lopez's voice in my head, as if her letter were being read aloud once more. You saved my life. Don't let anyone erase that. It steadied me for a breath, though my grip on the fork from the last exchange had not yet relaxed. Richard, as expected, seized the silence like a weapon. He leaned forward, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watch gleaming, the picture of someone who wanted every inch of his success seen and acknowledged. Closed 3 deals this week alone, he announced, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge meant to slice. Each one worth more than a soldier's pension. Money just grows if you know where to plant it. His words floated across the table like blades, slicing open the air. George, my father, chuckled and nodded, his approval obvious. He's right, Evelyn, he said without hesitation, turning toward me with eyes that carried not cruelty, but a kind of resigned practicality that hurt worse. You should have gone corporate. That's where the future is. My chest tightened as though the room had shrunk. I swallowed bitterness that clawed at my throat. It wasn't just Richard anymore. It was my own father, placing his stamp of approval on the mockery. Margaret's hand trembled as she adjusted a serving dish, pretending she hadn't heard, but her silence was its own verdict. Lucy's smile looked pasted on, her eyes refusing to meet mine, her laugh brittle when she offered one at Richard's remarks. I forced myself to sit still, my back straight, my breathing shallow. My mind screamed at me to speak, to remind them what 4 years away had meant missed holidays, sleepless nights, friends buried. But the words caught on the barbed wire of my throat. Instead, I let the pain build behind my ribs, let it fuel the silence I wore like armor. Richard took a slow sip of wine, savoring the moment, then leaned across the table. You know, Evelyn, he said, his smirk curling. Even Amazon pays better than the army. His voice carried triumph, like he had scored the final point in a game only he was playing. The laughter that followed was uneasy, thin, and scattered. Forks scraped plates. Glasses clinked too loudly. My mother tried to steer the conversation toward dessert preparations, but her voice was drowned beneath Richard's booming self-satisfaction. I looked around the table and saw nothing but complicity, my father's approving nods, Lucy's hollow chuckle, Richard's gleam of conquest. And then, just as the weight of silence pressed hardest against my chest, a voice cut through. David, quiet until now, set down his fork and looked at me with eyes far too clear for his age. Aunt Evelyn, he asked suddenly, his tone neither mocking nor hesitant, did you ever save someone's life out there? The room froze. Forks halted midair. The laughter died instantly. Silence fell. It wasn't the battlefield that made me feel alone, it was my own family. The thought tightened around my chest as we drifted from the dining room into the living room. Our plates cleared away, but the aftertaste of Richard's jabs still heavy in the air. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Michael Turner's name glowing across the screen. I pressed the side button quickly, silencing it before anyone noticed, unwilling to offer even a sliver of vulnerability to the room that had already made me its target. The living room was warm in theory, fire burning in the hearth, cushions plumped on the sofa, lamps spilling golden light over framed photos of vacations and graduations. Yet I felt the cold settle deeper, as though the fire itself recoiled from me. Lucy took her place beside Richard, her body angled toward him despite the unease lingering in her eyes. My parents claimed their armchairs, their posture calm, satisfied. David sat on the rug near the coffee table, knees pulled up, his gaze wandering toward me, then darting away whenever Richard's voice filled the space. Richard had no intention of letting the evening drift into peace. He stretched out, one arm sprawled along the back of the sofa, the other swirling his drink. His voice carried easily, shaping the air the way a commander would shape his troops. Only he wasn't leading anyone into battle, he was basking in the glow of his own victories, measured in contracts and cars and numbers with too many zeros. Success, he declared, raising his glass slightly, is simple math. You put in effort, you get rewarded. The market never lies. His words weren't aimed at the room. They were aimed at me, each syllable tipped like an arrow. George nodded approvingly, his voice gravelly but firm. He's right, Evelyn. Money talks. Respect follows it. He looked at me as if it were a lesson I should have learned years ago, as though every sacrifice I'd made had been a childish detour instead of duty. Margaret didn't contradict him. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes drifting to the fire, her silence complicit in a way that cut sharper than words. I kept mine pressed tight together, lips refusing to part. My silence wasn't surrender, it was the only weapon I could wield without exposing my throat. Inside, though, the words built pressure like steam sealed inside iron. They didn't see the nights without sleep, the sandstorms that stripped skin raw, the faces of comrades who never came home. To them, all that mattered was the ledger. Richard leaned forward, his smile predatory. Admit it, Evelyn, he said, his voice lowering to the kind of tone meant to corner prey. You're stuck in a dead-end gig. There's no climbing out of that uniform. His eyes glittered, daring me to break, daring me to snap in front of the family. The room held its breath. George and Margaret didn't argue with him. Lucy kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in her lap, her silence more damning than any agreement. David shifted on the rug, chewing his lip but saying nothing. The fire popped in the hearth, its crack a cruel echo of the words that still stung in my ears. I didn't move. My spine stiffened, my jaw locked, and I let the silence hang heavy. To them it might have looked like defeat, but inside it was calculation, every insult catalogued, every ally and enemy quietly marked. And then, again, the buzz in my pocket. My phone lit up against the dark fabric of my pants, Michael's name glowing insistently across the screen. Not every battlefield has bombs, some are set with porcelain plates and whisper lies. The laughter from the living room dulled into a low hum as I slipped onto the porch, the autumn air biting against my cheeks. The sky was already bruised with nightfall, and the porch light flickered like it had grown tired of shining. I let the cold steady me, but inside my chest, Maria's face flashed in memory, the blood on her cheek, the rasp of her voice. Survive. One day they'll know. Through the half-cracked window, voices carried, muffled but sharp enough to sting. Lucy's tone was strained, uncharacteristically urgent. You can't keep doing this, Richard. The accounts, I've seen them. The debts keep growing. Sooner or later, someone will notice. Richard's chuckle followed, confident and dismissive. He had perfected the art of laughing away disaster. Relax, Lucy. Debts are just numbers in the right hands. What matters is appearance, and no one will ever know, especially your soldier sister. My pulse quickened. His words cut deeper than his smirks at dinner. It wasn't just disdain. It was a mask slipping. My hand tightened around the porch rail as I pressed closer to the window. Lucy's voice trembled, as though she was forcing courage through clenched teeth. She deserves better than your insults, and if this comes out, you'll drag all of us down. He snorted, cruel amusement dripping from every syllable. She's too blind to see, Lucy. Always has been. A uniform doesn't teach you the real game. And you? You'll keep quiet. Because you love the life I give you. Silence followed inside, but I could imagine Lucy's face, her lips pressed tight, eyes brimming with doubt, yet chained by fear. She wouldn't fight him here. Not yet. I leaned back against the porch post, the wood cool against my shoulder, the night colder still. My heart pounded not just with anger, but with calculation. Richard wasn't invincible. Behind his boasts and flashy contracts, there was rot, and rot always spreads until it breaks through. The vibration in my pocket startled me. I pulled my phone free and froze at the subject line glowing against the screen. Confidential. Richard Hale, financial misconduct. The sender, attorney James Morton. My breath caught. My thumb hovered over the message, the glow of the screen painting my skin pale in the dark. Inside, Richard's voice carried again, low and smug, drowning out Lucy's silence. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by arrogance and money. I stared at the unopened email, knowing it could change everything, knowing it might be the key I didn't even realize I had been waiting for. My chest rose and fell with the weight of choice. One flick of my finger, and the truth would no longer be locked away. I hesitated, staring at the unopened email, knowing it could change everything. Sometimes silence is the perfect trap. I reminded myself of that as we filed back into the dining room, plates replaced with dessert. The apple pie's sweet scent should have been comforting, but the air pressed heavy against my skin, each breath tasting more of tension than sugar. Michael's words from earlier repeated in my mind like a hidden drumbeat. Tomorrow's Pentagon briefing, you'll be on speaker. A promise, a warning, maybe both. The lights glowed warm, but they no longer comforted me. Instead, they sharpened every edge of the room. The gleam of forks, the smudged rim of a wineglass, the slick grin stretching across Richard's face as he claimed his throne at the table. Lucy hovered by his side, smiling when expected, though her hands twisted the napkin in her lap. My mother poured coffee with trembling precision, avoiding my gaze. My father leaned forward, ready to nod along before Richard even spoke. And David, silent as always, studied me with that same searching curiosity I could never quite name. Richard launched his offensive without hesitation. "You know, Evelyn," he said, turning toward me as if announcing to a courtroom, "I was just telling Lucy about my old college friend, made partner before he hit 35. Multimillionaire now. Real success story. That's what happens when you aim high." His eyes flicked to me, the smirk widening. "Some people choose smaller paths," George grunted in approval. "Ambition pays off. He's proof of that." His words landed heavier than Richard's mockery, not because they were cruel, but because they carried conviction. My father believed him, believed in wealth over sacrifice, in contracts over service. Margaret didn't contradict him. She busied herself with her cup, staring into the dark swirl of coffee as if it held an escape. I lifted my glass of water, drinking slowly, forcing every swallow to be steady. The cool liquid steadied the heat rising in me, the burn of humiliation and anger pressing against my chest. Patience, I told myself. Silence was still my trap. Let him believe I was cornered. Let him overplay his hand. Richard leaned in, elbows on the table, his voice dropping to that cruel softness he favored when he wanted his words to sting. "You parade around with a rank on your shoulder, but tell me, what's it really worth? A handshake? A salute?" He shook his head, chuckling as though the answer were obvious. Lucy's eyes darted to me then away, her mouth tightening. Margaret shifted in her seat. David's fork hovered in midair, his eyes fixed on me as though waiting for anything that proved I wouldn't break. Richard's grin sharpened into its final blow. "You're nothing but a leech with a title on paper, but no real worth." The words slammed into me, echoing louder than any battlefield explosion. For a moment, the room itself seemed to tilt, every face illuminated in that awful, suffocating light, my father's nod of agreement, my mother's retreat into silence, Lucy's fragile complicity. I pressed the rim of the water glass against my lips until my knuckles whitened, willing myself not to shatter the fragile trap I had built with silence. And then, cutting through the heavy quiet, came the sudden buzz in my pocket. My phone lit up on the table, the screen bright against the dim dining room. The caller ID blazed in stark letters. Pentagon briefing call. The louder Richard laughed, the more I knew he was hiding something. His voice filled the living room as though the crackling fire and soft pop of champagne corks were accomplices in his performance. The flames painted shadows across the mantel where family photographs sat, smiles frozen in time, none of them including me in uniform. I sank into the armchair's stiff cushions, letting the hiss of bubbles in crystal glasses mask the rhythm of my own breathing. The unopened email from James Morton pressed against my mind like a weight in my pocket. An unplayed card I kept close to my chest. Richard held court from the center of the sofa, legs spread in easy arrogance, phone in hand as he scrolled through photos. He thrust the screen toward George and Margaret with the satisfaction of a magician revealing a trick. "That's the new office in London," he said, tapping the glossy image. "River view, full floor. Signed the lease last week. Our international deal is practically done. First quarter next year. Hale Technologies will double its valuation." George's eyes lit up, pride radiating across his face. "That's extraordinary, Richard. Exactly the kind of ambition this family needs." Margaret clapped her hands together gently, her voice warm, though it shook faintly. "So impressive, dear. So very impressive." Their admiration clung to the air, thick and suffocating, like incense in a too small chapel. Lucy sat at his side, her smile stretched thin. She laughed in the right places, nodded when expected, but her eyes betrayed the crack in her mask. Every so often her gaze slipped downward, a flicker of unease darting across her face before she smoothed it away. I watched it all in silence, each boast of Richard's, each nod of approval, each forced smile. Inside, my thoughts measured his every word against the numbers Morton's subject line had hinted at: contracts, valuations, deals. They were the pillars Richard propped himself up on, but pillars rot when built on sand. Richard refilled his glass, his laughter booming as he clinked it against my father's. "You see," he said, his tone triumphant, "this is what real battlefields look like. Not deserts and fatigues, not metals gathering dust. No, this is the battlefield that matters: contracts, not combat boots." He raised his glass higher, basking in the echo of his own declaration. The fire popped, scattering sparks up the chimney. For a moment the room fell still, waiting for my silence to continue. But I felt the words gather at the back of my throat, sharp and deliberate. I leaned forward just slightly, my voice low enough to sound accidental, yet clear enough to strike. The real battlefield doesn't come with air conditioning. Richard froze, glass hovering halfway to his lips. His eyes darted toward me, searching for the weakness he expected to find, the surrender he had been toying with all evening. Instead, he found stillness, my gaze steady and unreadable. A beat passed. Then he threw his head back and roared with laughter, loud and careless, as though I had handed him another line to mock. I sat back in my chair, my own silence curling like smoke around his arrogance. He thought he had won, thought my words were nothing but a slip of bitterness. He didn't realize the trap was already tightening. At midnight, the ghosts of war visit in ink and blood. The wind clawed at the shutters of the guest room, rattling them against the frame as if it wanted in. I sat on the edge of the bed, the old quilt bunched under my hands, the weight of silence pressing harder than any mortar fire. From my jacket pocket, I drew out the folded letter, its creases softened from being opened too many times. Maria Lopez's handwriting stretched across the page, uneven but fierce, the letters carrying more weight than the medals tucked away in my duffel. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the paper flat on my knees. Her words reached back to a night I thought I'd buried, a night the desert turned red, and the world shrank to the crack of rifles and the smell of blood in the sand. "You saved my life. Don't let anyone erase that." The letter bled into memory, pulling me back. We were pinned down, gunfire carving the dark, the hum of helicopters overhead drowned out by the screams of men caught in crossfire. Maria was on the ground, her uniform soaked crimson, her breath ragged. I remembered the weight of her body as I dragged her behind broken stone, bullets splitting the air inches above us. My hands pressed against her wound, slippery with her blood, her fingers clamping around my wrist like iron. Her eyes, wide and desperate, met mine. "Survive," she whispered, each syllable torn from her throat. "One day they'll know." The letter in my lap blurred as tears threatened to spill, but I blinked them back. My breathing slowed, steadied. They didn't know here, in this house, with its apple pies and champagne boasts, what that kind of night demanded. They only saw paychecks, not the cost of blood. The screen of my phone lit up suddenly, dragging me back to the quiet of the guest room. A message from Michael. "Tomorrow, you'll be on speaker. They'll all hear." I stared at the words, the glow illuminating the trembling paper still open on my knees. My chest tightened, a mixture of dread and relief tangling inside me. For years I had carried my silence like a shield, letting their scorn wash over me. Did I need them to know? Did I need their recognition after everything I'd already survived? My voice cracked the stillness, soft but resolute. I don't need them to know. But maybe it's time. The floorboards outside creaked, and through the door came a muffled voice, Richard's smug baritone curling through the wood. "Tomorrow, I'll announce the deal. Everyone will see who runs this family." I pressed the letter flat again, Maria's ink and blood against my hands, the storm inside me clashing with his arrogance. Two truths were preparing to meet, and one would shatter. Sometimes gratitude is just another kind of prison. The autumn air was sharp against my face as I stepped onto the back porch the next morning, the wooden planks creaking beneath my boots. The trees beyond the yard had shed half their leaves, their bare branches scratching at the pale sky. My father sat in his usual spot, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, a chipped mug of tea steaming between his hands. He looked up when he heard me, but his eyes carried no warmth, only the guarded weight of a man who had rehearsed something too many times. I leaned against the porch railing, letting the chill bite through my jacket. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind chasing dead leaves across the yard. Finally, George cleared his throat. There's something you don't understand about Richard. His tone was steady, almost lecturing. Years ago, when we were drowning in debt, he stepped in. He bailed us out. Without him, we would have lost this house. The words landed like stones in my gut. Pieces clicked together, explaining the blind loyalty I'd seen at the table, the way my father defended Richard at every turn. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing, waiting. George sipped his tea, his eyes fixed on the steam. You think he's arrogant, but you forget he saved our home. Everything you see around you, it's here because of him. His voice softened, but not with kindness, with finality. You should be grateful. Grateful. The words scraped against my ribs. He hadn't been there when Maria whispered for her life in my arms. He hadn't seen the sacrifices carved into my skin. Yet he expected gratitude for Richard, a man who traded money for devotion, like it was another contract. I swallowed hard, my voice low. You think debt makes him a savior? It makes you his prisoner. His eyes flicked to me, narrowing, but he didn't argue. Instead, he set the mug down with a sharp click. Richard is the future of this family, he said, the conviction in his voice more cutting than any insult. I turned away, staring at the yard, letting the words pierce without showing the wound. My hands slid into my pocket, fingers curling around my phone. I unlocked it and scrolled to the unopened email from James Morton. For a moment, I just stared at the subject line. Confidential. Richard Hale financial misconduct. My thumb hovered, heart thundering in my chest. I tapped. The screen filled with rows of spreadsheets, contracts riddled with red flags, evidence of debts far greater than the ones my father had confessed. Fraudulent numbers, shadow accounts, the scaffolding of Richard's empire built on lies. The glow of the screen lit my face, each column another nail in the mask he wore. I held the phone tighter, breath sharp in the cold air. My father's voice still echoed, Richard is the future of this family. But now, at last, I had proof that his future was nothing but smoke. The higher Richard climbed, the harder I prepared to let him fall. Evening settled over the house, the windows glowing against the dark outside, the dining room thick with the forced air of celebration. The table had been reset, wine glasses polished, candles flickering, as though the night were meant for triumph. Richard stood at the head, his presence filling the space with the same smug weight he carried in every word. I had slipped Morton's files onto a small USB drive earlier, the cold plastic pressed against my palm like a hidden blade. It rested now in my pocket, a weapon that needed no trigger, just timing. The memory of Morton's warning echoed steady in my mind. Truth cannot stay buried. Richard cleared his throat theatrically, drawing every eye toward him. Lucy sat rigid beside him, her fingers twisting her napkin into knots. George leaned forward eagerly, his pride swelling in anticipation, while Margaret kept her eyes fixed on Richard, as though willing him to deliver the family's salvation. David sat quietly at the far end, his fork untouched, his gaze shifting between Richard and me with a knowing sharpness. I have a major announcement, Richard declared, letting the pause stretch for effect. We've secured a multi-million-dollar contract overseas. Hale Technologies will expand into Europe. This is the beginning of a dynasty. His grin gleamed in the candlelight, his voice dripping with self-anointed glory. Applause broke out, not from everyone, but enough. George clapped hard, his voice rough with approval. Outstanding, Richard. That's the kind of vision we need. Margaret echoed with a soft, so proud of you, her words falling like leaves, weightless yet suffocating. Lucy smiled tightly, but her eyes betrayed unease, the tremor in her hands betraying cracks she tried to hide. I remained silent, steady, my gaze locked on Richard as if studying an opponent already weakening at the knees. Inside, I turned the words over like stones in my palm, cataloging every boast, every claim. All of it sat atop the hollow scaffolding Morton's spreadsheets had revealed. Richard's eyes flicked toward me, finding fuel in my stillness. He lifted his glass, savoring the moment before delivering the barb he had been waiting to throw. You'll never escape your paper rank, Evelyn, he said, his voice thick with disdain. Wealth defines worth. And well, you'll never understand that. The words rippled through the room, drawing nervous laughter from George, silence from Margaret, and a wince from Lucy. David's fork scraped faintly against his plate, the sound sharp in the quiet that followed. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low but audible, slicing through the silence with calm precision. Be careful what defines you. Richard scoffed immediately, dismissing the words with a flick of his hand, his grin unshaken. He had no idea that the storm already brewed above his head, that the ground beneath him was cracking. My silence wasn't submission, it was the patient wait of a hunter who knew the prey was too blind to see the trap. It wasn't the laughter that shook me, it was the silence before the call. The dining room had emptied of joy long ago. Only crumbs of pie and half-melted ice cream marked the table, the plates scattered like remnants of a battle no one dared clean up yet. The candles burned lower, their flicker throwing uneasy shadows across faces that had spent the evening rehearsing indifference. Michael's voice returned in my mind, steady and certain. "I'll put you on speaker." His promise, a thread I held tightly, wound through every mocking word I had swallowed tonight. Richard leaned back in his chair, the stem of his glass spinning idly between his fingers. He smirked, leaning into the silence as if it belonged to him. "You know, Evelyn," he drawled, "all this talk of service and sacrifice, it sounds noble, sure. But let's be honest, what did it get you? Nothing but a pat on the back and a salary that barely pays for gas. Service doesn't mean success. We all know that." George gave a small, reluctant nod, a shadow of agreement flickering across his face. Margaret pressed her napkin flat on her lap, her lips tight but silent. Lucy shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Only David stared at me, wide-eyed, his silence a quiet rebellion against the chorus of dismissal. I lifted my gaze slowly, letting the weight of it land on Richard. My face betrayed nothing, but inside, a calm spread like a tide coming in. For once, he didn't see pain or anger, he saw patience. That unsettled him, though he masked it with another smirk. Then the sound split the air, the shrill buzz of my phone vibrating against the wood of the table. The screen lit up bright against the dim room, words glowing like a flare in the dark. "Pentagon briefing call, Michael Turner." Richard chuckled, leaning forward, his eyes dancing with fresh cruelty. "Probably your war buddies begging for beer money," he sneered, raising his glass in mock salute. My hand closed around the phone. I pressed the green icon, switched to speaker, and set it down in the center of the table. Michael's voice filled the room, crisp, authoritative, undeniable. "Colonel Carter, you're leading the Pentagon briefing in 5 minutes. The nation is waiting." When Michael's voice filled the room, the laughter died instantly. The sound of it was a clean break, like glass shattering on the hardwood floor. Every mocking chuckle, every sneer Richard had stacked against me, evaporated in a single breath. The room froze around the speakerphone glowing on the table, the half-empty plates forgotten, the wine staining the rims of abandoned glasses. "Colonel Carter," Michael said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority that no one at this table could deny. "The Pentagon has confirmed you'll lead the national briefing in 5 minutes. We need you on secure line now. The secretary will join shortly." The title cracked like thunder. My name, my rank, reverberated against the walls that had heard only mockery for hours. George's hand paused mid-motion, fork dangling uselessly. Margaret pressed her fingers to her mouth, eyes wide. Lucy stiffened, her knuckles white against her napkin. Even David, who had watched in silence all evening, leaned forward, his gaze burning with something close to pride. And Richard stammered. His mouth opened and closed like a man suddenly robbed of air. The smirk that had been glued to his face all night faltered, his glass lowering without ceremony. "Colonel?" he muttered under his breath, disbelief souring the syllables. I sat straighter, letting the silence stretch. My heartbeat drummed, but my voice was calm, steady, ironclad. "I'm here, Michael. Standby connection secure." Michael's voice carried on, clear and deliberate. "You'll be speaking for the operations unit. The press will stream live after internal briefing. We'll patch you through as soon as the secretary joins. America's watching, Colonel." The words hung heavy, undeniable, impossible to laugh away. Every eye at the table turned to me, the weight of their stunned silence pressing in. Richard's hand shook as he set down his glass. His arrogance, once suffocating, now lay cracked open, hollow. I rose from my chair, pushing it back with quiet finality. "Excuse me," I said, voice sharp as steel. "Duty calls." I didn't need to look at him. His crumbling mask was reflected in every stunned face around the table. The phone buzzed again just as I turned. Another notification slid across the screen, bright in the dim dining room. Morton. Media release on Richard Hale scheduled at midnight. The silence that followed was thicker than any laughter had ever been. Truth doesn't whisper, it crashes like glass. The living room was steeped in half-light, the television humming softly in the corner. Plates still cluttered the coffee table, a few crumbs clinging stubbornly to porcelain as though refusing to leave. No one spoke. The echo of Michael's voice from the Pentagon call still hung in the air, impossible to banish. I sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, every muscle taut, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The program on television cut suddenly, the anchor's voice sharp, urgent. Breaking news. Hale Technologies is now under federal investigation for fraud and financial misconduct. The words knifed through the silence, and the room reacted in fragments. George's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the rug, whiskey seeping into the fibers. Margaret gasped, clutching at her chest as if the sound had been aimed directly at her heart. Lucy's fingers trembled around her napkin, the white fabric twisting tighter and tighter until it looked ready to rip. On screen, documents flashed screenshots, spreadsheets, contracts annotated with glaring red warnings. Morton's leaks, alive in the public eye. Account numbers, shell companies, transactions masked with false names. Proof, undeniable, blazing across the screen. Richard lurched to his feet, his voice a roar breaking the stunned hush. "This is all her doing," he shouted, his arm slashing toward me like an accusation could shield him from the truth unraveling in front of his family. His face flushed crimson, sweat beading along his hairline. "She set me up. She's been plotting this from the start." The anchor's voice droned on, damning in its calmness, listing violations, investigations, subpoenas. Every word stacked higher, building a wall around Richard's lies until there was no way out. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let his rage flail wildly, because the louder he shouted, the more his mask cracked. His empire wasn't being dismantled by my hand, it was collapsing under the weight of his own deceit. Lucy's chair scraped against the floor as she rose, her face pale, her body trembling. For a long moment she stood frozen, caught between loyalty and the avalanche of truth. Then her voice broke, shattering the last veneer of silence. "No, Richard, you lied to all of us." The words landed harder than any headline, harder than any leak. They silenced even him. The battlefield was quiet, but the enemy was already in ashes. The dining room lay in disarray, plates smeared with pie and cream abandoned mid-bite, a wineglass overturned near Richard's chair, its contents bleeding into the tablecloth. The laughter that had once smothered me in this room was gone, replaced by the stale weight of shock. I stood near the doorway, Maria's words threading through me again. "Survive so they know." Tonight, they finally knew. Richard slumped in his chair, his tie loosened, hair damp with sweat. His eyes darted from one face to another, hunting for an ally, but finding only the wreckage of his own making. "This is temporary," he muttered, over and over. "A misunderstanding. I can fix it. I just need time. The media exaggerates." Each excuse rang hollower than the last, dissipating in the heavy silence. George leaned back, his broad shoulders sagging, as if he had aged a decade in minutes. His fork lay untouched before him, the lines around his mouth drawn deep with shame. "All this time," he whispered, his voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before, "we thought you were building something lasting." His gaze flicked toward me for the briefest moment, then fell, weighted with guilt. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her napkin, though no words came. She looked smaller somehow, the peacekeeper stripped of illusions, left only with the knowledge of her complicity. Lucy pressed both hands to her face, tears spilling through her fingers. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, her voice cracking when she finally forced the confession out. "I chose you," she said to Richard, her eyes wet and wild. "I believed you. I defended you against her. And all along, you were lying." The words shattered between sobs, cutting through the space more brutally than Richard's rage ever had. He lifted his head suddenly, his expression twisted between fury and desperation. His finger jabbed toward me, the last arrow in a quiver long since emptied. "You destroyed me," he spat, the words breaking apart on his tongue. His chest heaved, his voice ragged, but still he tried to hold onto the lie of his own power. I stepped forward just enough for my voice to land evenly in the air, calm as a blade drawn without haste. I didn't need to. The truth did. The silence that followed was final, like dirt falling on a coffin. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it speaks through the youngest lips. The dining room had sunk into a stillness that felt heavier than any argument. Candlelight flickered against the walls, shadows stretching long and brittle across the overturned glasses and stained tablecloth. No one moved. No one dared speak. Richard's chest rose and fell in shallow bursts as he slumped deeper in his chair. The mask of arrogance shattered, his empire reduced to headlines and shame. Maria's words still echoed inside me, survive so they know. Tonight, they knew. Yet I hadn't spoken. I hadn't needed to. Silence had done the work, stripping away every illusion until only truth remained. George stared into his hands, the rough lines of his palms etched with the weight of regret. Margaret sat with her eyes lowered, napkin crushed tightly in her fist. Lucy's tears had slowed to silent drops, her gaze fixed on the man she once defended. No one rushed to him. No one lifted him up. For once, his power ended at the edge of his own chair. And then, into that silence, David's voice rose. Clear, steady, unshaken. "Aunt Evelyn doesn't need money to be great," he said, his words carrying across the table like a gavel striking wood. His small hands were folded neatly in front of him, his eyes burning with a conviction far older than his years. "She's the one I want to be like." The room inhaled sharply, as if the very air recognized the verdict being delivered. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders sagged further, and for the first time, true speechlessness overtook him. George blinked, his face tightening as if David's words had struck harder than any headline. Margaret's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Lucy turned her face away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. David's words lingered, echoing long after they left his lips. The boy who had stayed quiet through the jeers, who had watched when no one else would, had broken the silence with a truth no one could dispute. It was simple, undeniable, and devastating. My throat tightened, not with pain but with something softer, rarer. I turned toward David, and for the first time that night, a smile formed small, fragile, but real. When the door closed behind me, the house remained in shadow. The air in the front hallway was cooler, cleaner, as though the walls themselves had exhaled after hours of suffocating tension. I reached for my coat hanging on the rack, the familiar fabric rough against my fingers. The faint vibration of my phone pulsed in my pocket, Michael's text glowing quietly. "We'll meet again soon." I slipped one arm through the sleeve, then the other, my movements unhurried, deliberate. Behind me, the dining room sat heavy with silence. George stood by the archway, his arms crossed, though his face betrayed no strength, only shame. Margaret hovered near him, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes shimmering with tears she would not release. Neither spoke. Their silence was its own confession. On the floor beyond them, Lucy knelt beside Richard's chair, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She no longer reached for him, no longer offered excuses or defenses. The bond that had bound her to his arrogance had finally snapped, leaving only grief for what she had chosen to believe. Richard slumped forward, his once boastful posture reduced to a hollow shell. His eyes stared at nothing, the mask of power gone, replaced by the vacant expression of a man who had lost everything. The autumn wind slipped through the cracks around the door, carrying with it the smell of fallen leaves and the promise of a colder night. It lifted the edge of my hair as I reached for the handle, the moonlight spilling in through the narrow glass pane and casting a pale path across the hardwood floor. "Evelyn!" The sound of my name broke through the silence. David's small footsteps hurried behind me. He caught my sleeve just before I stepped over the threshold, his young face flushed with urgency. His voice trembled but carried with it a force no one else in that house could summon. "I'll never forget tonight." The words stilled me, sank deep. I turned, the door half open, and looked down at him. His eyes were wide, earnest, carrying not the weight of shame, but the seed of something brighter. My lips curved into a faint smile, a gesture fragile yet unshakable. For a moment the house behind me was nothing but shadow, while the world beyond the doorway stretched open beneath silver light. I stepped forward, the glow wrapping around me, leaving the darkness behind. The house of shadows was left behind, and truth stood brighter than wealth or titles. Richard's fall showed how arrogance built on lies cannot stand, while Evelyn's quiet resolve proved that dignity outlives ridicule. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. Like the final flame cutting through darkness, justice may come late, but it never comes empty. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the same sense of justice, or 2 if you wished for more.